The drill sergeant's voice cut through the humid Georgia air like a blade. Martinez, you're done. Pack your bags. You're out. Sarah Martinez stood there, sweat dripping from her brow, her rifle hanging loosely in her trembling hands. Around her, the other recruits avoided eye contact, grateful it wasn't them facing the humiliation of washing out of Army basic training in the 7th week. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had dreamed of military service since she was 12 years old, watching her older brother Marcus return from his first deployment in Afghanistan. The way he carried himself, the discipline, the purpose, she wanted that. She needed that. Growing up in East Los Angeles, opportunities were limited, but the military represented something more, a chance to serve something greater than herself, to prove that a girl from the barrio could make a difference. But standing there on that dusty training ground at Fort Benning, Sarah felt like she was drowning. It wasn't the physical demands that broke her, though at 5'4" and barely 125 pounds, she struggled with some of the strength requirements. It wasn't the mental pressure, though the constant screaming and degradation wore her down. It was the shooting. For weeks, she'd been the worst marksman in her entire company. While other recruits consistently hit their targets at 200 and 300 meters, Sarah couldn't reliably hit a target at 50 meters. Her hands shook every time she picked up the M4 carbine. Her breathing was erratic. Her stance was all wrong, according to every instructor who tried to help her. "Martinez, you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn if you were standing inside it," Sergeant Williams had shouted just that morning during qualification day. She'd needed to score at least 23 out of 40 targets to pass. She scored 12. It was her third and final attempt. The irony was crushing. Sarah had been fascinated with precision and accuracy her entire life. As a child, she'd spent hours throwing small stones at cans lined up on a fence behind her grandmother's house in Tijuana during summer visits. She could hit those cans from 50 feet away with startling consistency. She'd been the champion of her high school's dart team. Not exactly a prestige sport, but she'd never missed the bullseye when it mattered. But military rifles were different. The weight, the recoil, the pressure of performance, it all combined into a perfect storm of failure. Each missed shot chipped away at her confidence until she was overthinking every squeeze of the trigger, every breath, every muscle movement. "I don't understand it," she'd whispered to her bunkmate, Private Chen, the night before her final qualification attempt. "I can feel where the bullet needs to go. I can visualize it hitting the target, but something happens between my brain and my trigger finger." Chen, who had easily qualified on her first attempt, tried to be encouraging. "Maybe the Army isn't the right fit. Have you thought about the Air Force? Or maybe civilian life isn't so bad." But Sarah couldn't accept that. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her entire family had invested their hopes in her success. Her mother, Maria, cleaned office buildings at night to help pay for Sarah's college preparations before she'd decided to enlist. Her younger sister, Carmen, told everyone at school that her sister was going to be a soldier. Her father, Roberto, who worked construction despite a bad back, had driven her to the recruiter's office and waited in the parking lot for 3 hours while she took her ASVAB test. "Mija," he'd said that day, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel, "you're going to do something important. I can feel it." Now, walking toward the barracks to collect her belongings, Sarah felt the weight of disappointing everyone who believed in her. The other recruits moved aside as she passed, creating a bubble of awkward space around her failure. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed relieved it wasn't them. A few appeared almost smug, as if her failure somehow validated their own success. The discharge papers were already being prepared. She would leave Fort Benning the next morning, returning to Los Angeles with her tail between her legs. The GI Bill benefits she'd hoped to use for college were gone. The career she'd envisioned was over before it started. The respect she'd wanted to earn was replaced
by the shame of not being good enough. But as Sarah packed her duffel bag that evening, folding her civilian clothes that suddenly felt foreign after 7 weeks in uniform, she couldn't shake a strange feeling. Despite everything, despite the humiliation, the public failure, the crushing disappointment, something deep inside her whispered that this wasn't the end of her story. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the messages from her family. Dozens of texts offering encouragement, love, and support. Her grandmother's voice message in Spanish, telling her that sometimes God closes one door to open another. Her brother Marcus had sent a simple message: failure is not falling down. Failure is not getting back up. Sarah looked out the barracks window at the night sky over Georgia. Stars twinkled in the darkness, each one representing something unreachable, yet somehow present and real. Tomorrow she would leave this place defeated, but something told her that her journey with the military wasn't over. She just didn't know that in 18 months, those same hands that couldn't qualify with a rifle would be steadying a sniper scope over the most dangerous shot in special operations history.
18 months after her devastating failure at Fort Benning, Sarah Martinez was working the night shift at a 24-hour diner in Riverside, California, serving coffee to truckers and insomniacs. The uniform she wore now was polyester and stained with grease instead of military camouflage. Her dreams of military service felt like they belonged to someone else, a naive girl who thought she could overcome anything with determination alone. But life has a way of presenting second chances in the most unexpected ways. It was 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday when 3 men in civilian clothes walked into Murphy's diner. Sarah noticed them immediately: their posture, their awareness of the room, the way they automatically positioned themselves with clear sight lines to both the entrance and the kitchen. Military, definitely. Probably special operations, judging by their quiet confidence and the fact that they were clearly exhausted, but still alert. She poured their coffee without being asked and left them alone. In her 18 months of serving mostly military personnel from the nearby base, she'd learned to recognize when soldiers needed space to decompress. "Ma'am," one of them, a compact man with graying temples and intelligent eyes, gestured for her to come over. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without raising his voice. "Yes, sir?" "We couldn't help but notice your pendant." He nodded toward the small silver cross she wore, inscribed with the words Fort Benning 2023, that her grandmother had given her. "You serve?" Sarah's cheeks burned with familiar shame. "I tried to. Didn't work out." The 3 men exchanged glances. The leader, she could tell he was the leader, despite the lack of visible rank, leaned back in his booth. "What happened?" Something about his tone made her answer honestly instead of deflecting with the vague responses she'd perfected over the past year and a half. "Couldn't shoot. Failed qualification 3 times. Got discharged in week 7. Another exchange of looks. The second man, younger with intense blue eyes, spoke up. "What was your issue? Mechanics, nerves, equipment?" Sarah found herself sitting down across from them, drawn into the conversation despite herself. "I don't know. I've been good with precision my whole life. Darts, small targets, you name it. But put a rifle in my hands and—" She shrugged, the familiar weight of failure settling on her shoulders. "Show me." The leader pushed a sugar packet across the table. "Pretend this is a target. Show me your shooting stance." It was an odd request, but something about these men commanded compliance. Sarah stood up and demonstrated her stance, feet positioned, weight distributed, imaginary rifle raised to her shoulder. The 3 men watched intently, their expressions unreadable. "There's your problem," the third man said quietly. He was the oldest of the 3, with scars on his hands and a slight limp when he'd walked in. "You're fighting the weapon instead of partnering with it." "I'm sorry, who are you guys?" Sarah asked, suddenly aware that this conversation had taken an unusual turn. The leader pulled out his wallet and showed her an ID that made her heart skip. "Commander Jake Morrison,
Naval Special Warfare Command. These are my associates, Chief Petty Officer Mike Santos and Master Chief Ray Kowalski. He paused, studying her face. We're recruiters, but not the kind you've met before. Sarah's mind raced. Navy SEALs. In her diner, talking to her about shooting. I don't understand. Sit down, Morrison said gently. We need to tell you about a program you've never heard of and a problem that every special operations unit in the military is facing. She sat, her coffee growing cold as Morrison continued. There's a new initiative, highly classified, very selective. We're looking for individuals with specific skill sets for specialized roles within SEAL teams. Not traditional operators, but specialists who can fill critical capability gaps. Santos leaned forward. The modern battlefield requires precision assets that can operate in environments and situations that traditional training doesn't address. We're talking about shots that need to be made under conditions that would break most military snipers. But I can't shoot, Sarah protested. That's why I'm here instead of in the Army. You can't shoot military rifles under military conditions using military techniques, Kowalski corrected. But we think your problem isn't ability, it's methodology. Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed her a series of photographs. Urban environments, complex trajectories, impossible angles. These are actual mission requirements we faced in the past year. Shots that our best snipers couldn't make, not because they lack skill, but because they lack a different kind of thinking. I still don't understand what this has to do with me. You told us you were good with precision before the military. What kind of precision? Sarah found herself describing her childhood games, the dart championships, even her strange ability to predict where objects would fall or bounce. As she talked, the three SEALs listened with an intensity that made her self-conscious. Show us, Morrison said when she finished. He pulled out a napkin 20 feet away near the kitchen. Hit that with this. He handed her a sugar packet. Sarah looked around the empty diner, then focused on the dispenser. She drew back her arm and released the packet in a smooth arc. It struck the metal dispenser with a soft thunk and fell to the floor. The three men looked at each other again, and this time, Sarah saw something different in their expressions. Not surprise, but confirmation. Sarah Martinez, Morrison said slowly, how would you like a chance to serve your country in a way that plays to your actual strengths instead of forcing you into a mold that doesn't fit? What are you talking about? We're talking about giving you a second chance. Not in the Army, not as a regular soldier, but as something entirely different. Something that might just save lives that no one else can save. What kind of something? Morrison smiled for the first time since entering the diner. The kind that would make your family very proud.
2 weeks later, Sarah found herself on a military transport plane heading to an undisclosed location in Virginia. She'd signed more non-disclosure agreements than she could count, undergone extensive background checks, and endured a psychological evaluation that probed every corner of her mind. Her family thought she was attending a specialized training program for private security, a half-truth that let her sleep at night. The compound where the plane landed looked nothing like Fort Benning. Instead of sprawling training fields and barracks, she saw a collection of nondescript buildings surrounded by dense forest. The only indication of its military nature was the subtle but unmistakable presence of serious security. Commander Morrison met her at the airfield, now wearing fatigues that bore no unit insignia or rank indicators. Welcome to the Naval Special Warfare Advanced Capabilities Development Center, he said, leading her toward a waiting vehicle. Most people just call it the farm. How many people know about this place? Sarah asked, looking around at the surprisingly small facility. Need to know basis. And right now, you need to know that what we're going to show you over the next few weeks will challenge everything you think you understand about military operations. The compound where the plane landed looked nothing like Fort Benning. Instead of sprawling training fields and barracks, she saw a collection of nondescript buildings surrounded by dense forest. The only indication of its military nature was the subtle but unmistakable presence of serious security. Commander Morrison met her at the airfield, now wearing fatigues that bore no unit insignia or rank indicators.
"Welcome to the Naval Special Warfare Advanced Capabilities Development Center," he said, leading her toward a waiting vehicle. "Most people just call it the farm." "How many people know about this place?" Sarah asked, looking around at the surprisingly small facility. "Need to know basis. And right now, you need to know that what we're going to show you over the next few weeks will challenge everything you think you understand about military operations." The vehicle stopped in front of a building that looked like a cross between a laboratory and a workshop. Inside, Sarah saw equipment she'd never imagined: advanced optics, weapons she didn't recognize, and computer systems that seemed more suited to NASA than the Navy. "This is where we develop solutions to problems that don't have solutions," Morrison explained, leading her through a series of rooms filled with technical personnel working on projects she couldn't begin to understand. "And this is where we discovered something interesting about precision shooting that the military has been getting wrong for decades." They entered a conference room where Chief Santos and Master Chief Kowalski were waiting along with two people Sarah hadn't met: a woman in a lab coat who looked like a scientist and a man in civilian clothes who had the bearing of a former operator. "Sarah, meet Dr. Jennifer Walsh, our sports psychology and human performance specialist, and Tom Bradley, formerly of Delta Force, now our unconventional warfare consultant." Dr. Walsh stepped forward, her handshake firm and her eyes sharp with intelligence. "I've reviewed your file from Fort Benning, including the detailed analysis of your shooting performance. I think I know why you failed, and more importantly, why that failure might actually be an asset." "I don't understand." Traditional military marksmanship training is based on standardization. Same stance, same breathing pattern, same trigger squeeze, same everything. It works for most people because it's designed to work for the average person. But you're not average. Your psychological profile shows something we rarely see: an intuitive understanding of complex three-dimensional relationships combined with an almost supernatural ability to predict movement and trajectory. Sarah frowned. "If that's true, why couldn't I hit targets at basic training?" "Because they were trying to teach you to shoot like everyone else," Dr. Walsh replied. "It's like trying to teach a left-handed person to write with their right hand. Technically possible, but you'll never achieve their full potential." Commander Morrison activated a large display screen that showed video footage from what appeared to be recent military operations. "Sarah, what you're about to see is classified at the highest levels. These are actual combat situations where traditional sniper capabilities failed." The first video showed an urban environment, buildings at impossible angles, with a target visible only through series of windows and doorways that created a complex geometric challenge. 17 different snipers attempted this shot over 3 days. All experts, all highly trained, all failed. The second video showed a moving target on water, visible only for seconds at a time, through a pattern of obstacles that seemed to shift constantly. This target was carrying information that could have prevented an attack that killed 14 civilians. 6 different sniper teams missed the opportunity. The third video made Sarah's breath catch. It showed a hostage situation where the target was holding a child, visible only through a narrow gap that appeared and disappeared based on the movement of multiple people. This happened 4 months ago. We had one chance, one shot to save that child's life. Our best people couldn't make it work. "What happened to the child?" Sarah asked quietly. The room fell silent. Morrison's jaw tightened. "That's why you're here." Dr. Walsh moved to the whiteboard and began drawing diagrams. "These situations require a different kind of thinking, not just precision, but predictive precision. Not just accuracy, but accuracy based on understanding systems, movement, timing, and probability in ways that can't be taught through traditional methods." "You've demonstrated these abilities your entire life," Bradley added. "Childhood games, dart competitions, even the way you predicted where that sugar packet needed to go in the diner. You see patterns that others miss. You understand movement and timing in ways that most people, including highly trained snipers, simply don't." Sarah looked around the room at these serious, experienced professionals who were talking about her like she possessed some kind of superpower. But I failed basic marksmanship training. Because they were trying to make you shoot like them, Morrison said. We want to teach you to shoot like you. What exactly are you proposing? 6 weeks of the most intensive, unconventional training you can imagine, Dr. Walsh replied. We're going to throw out every traditional shooting technique and help you develop methods that work with your natural abilities, not against them. And if it works, Morrison's expression grew serious. If it works, you'll be capable of making shots that save lives in situations where everyone else has failed. You'll be the asset that gets called in when the impossible needs to become possible. And if it doesn't work, then you go back to your diner, and we keep looking for someone else who can do what needs to be done. Sarah thought about the child in the video, about the 14 civilians who died, about all the impossible situations where traditional solutions weren't enough. She thought about her family's faith in her, about her brother's message about getting back up after falling. When do we start?
The training began at dawn the next morning, and it was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Instead of a traditional shooting range with neat rows of targets at measured distances, she found herself in what looked like a three-dimensional puzzle made of mirrors, moving platforms, and obstacles that shifted position every few minutes. Forget everything you learned at basic training, Dr. Walsh instructed, handing Sarah a rifle that felt completely different from the standard M4 she'd struggled with. This weapon was custom-built, lighter, with an adjustable stock and grip that seemed to mold itself to her hands. It's not about following a checklist of procedures. This is about learning to communicate with physics. For the first week, Sarah wasn't allowed to fire a single shot. Instead, she spent hours studying ballistics, but not in the way she'd expected. Rather than memorizing charts and formulas, she was taught to visualize trajectories as living things, paths that curved and danced through space, affected by wind, gravity, temperature, and a dozen other variables that traditional training treated as obstacles to overcome, rather than partners in a dance. Bullets don't fly straight, Master Chief Kowalski explained during one session, using a laser to show her how projectiles actually moved through space. They follow mathematical curves that most shooters fight against instead of working with. You need to see those curves in your mind before you ever squeeze a trigger. The psychological training was even more intense. Dr. Walsh had Sarah performing exercises that seemed completely unrelated to marksmanship, predicting the path of bouncing balls, estimating the timing of complex mechanical movements, even throwing objects at targets while blindfolded to develop what she called intuitive trajectory awareness. Your brain already understands these concepts, Dr. Walsh explained after Sarah successfully hit a moving target with a tennis ball while wearing a blindfold. Traditional military training tries to replace that intuitive understanding with mechanical processes. We're doing the opposite. We're removing the interference so your natural abilities can function. But it wasn't just about shooting. The program included intensive physical conditioning designed specifically for Sarah's body type and the unique demands of the missions she would face. Instead of trying to build raw strength, the training focused on stability, breathing control, and what the instructors called dynamic stillness, the ability to become perfectly motionless even while adrenaline flooded her system. Special operations snipers often have the luxury of prepared positions, ideal conditions, and time to set up their shots, Bradley explained during a training session, where Sarah had to maintain perfect stillness while balancing on an unstable platform. What you're being trained for doesn't allow any of those luxuries. You'll need to make perfect shots from imperfect positions under impossible conditions. The mental conditioning was perhaps the most challenging aspect. Traditional sniper training emphasized detachment, becoming emotionally separated from the target and the consequences of the shot. Sarah's training took the opposite approach. You need to feel everything, Dr. Walsh instructed during a session where Sarah was required to study detailed backgrounds of potential targets, not to dehumanize them, but to understand them as complete human beings. The weight of what you're doing, the lives at stake, the complexity of the situation, that emotional awareness won't interfere with your performance. It will enhance it. This approach went against everything Sarah thought she knew about military precision.
How can emotional involvement make me more accurate? She asked during a particularly intense session. Because your natural abilities are connected to your empathy. Your intuitive understanding of movement and timing isn't just about physics, it's about understanding living systems. When you threw stones at cans as a child, you weren't just calculating trajectories, you were connecting with the entire system. Your body, the stone, the air, the target, even your own emotional state. By the third week, Sarah was finally allowed to fire live rounds, but not at traditional targets. Instead, she shot at problems, complex scenarios where multiple variables changed constantly, where the target appeared and disappeared according to unpredictable patterns, where wind and lighting conditions shifted every few minutes. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her first successful shot came during a scenario that had stumped several experienced snipers. The target was a small balloon that appeared for exactly 1.2 seconds every 30 seconds, visible only through a gap between two moving pendulums at a distance of 400 meters in gusty wind conditions. Sarah studied the pattern for 10 minutes, watching the pendulums, timing the balloon's appearance, feeling the wind's rhythm. Then, she closed her eyes for 30 seconds, visualizing the entire sequence in her mind, not just the mechanics, but the flow, the timing, the moment when all the variables would align. When she opened her eyes and raised the rifle, something clicked. She could see the path the bullet needed to take, not as a straight line, but as a curve that would intersect with the balloon's position at the exact moment of its brief visibility. She squeezed the trigger during a moment when the balloon wasn't even visible, timing the shot so the bullet would arrive precisely when the target appeared. The balloon popped. The room fell silent. Commander Morrison, who had been watching from the observation deck, spoke into his radio. That shot just broke the facility record for that scenario, by 4 seconds. But Sarah barely heard him. She was staring at the rifle in her hands, finally understanding what her instructors had been trying to teach her. This wasn't about overpowering the weapon or forcing it to obey her will. It was about becoming part of a system that included her body, her mind, the rifle, the bullet, the air, and the target, all working together in perfect harmony. "How do you feel?" Dr. Walsh asked. "Like I've been trying to play a violin with a hammer my whole life, and someone just handed me a bow."
By the fourth week of training, Sarah was consistently making shots that veteran snipers called impossible. But her instructors weren't satisfied with consistency. They were preparing her for situations where impossible was just the beginning. "Today we're going to teach you about shooting around corners," Bradley announced, leading her to a training area that looked like a funhouse mirror maze crossed with an obstacle course. "That's not physically possible," Sarah replied, examining the setup. The targets were completely hidden behind solid barriers, visible only through a series of mirrors positioned at various angles. "Not directly, no," Bradley agreed, "but bullets can ricochet in predictable ways if you understand the physics and have the precision to control them." For the next 3 days, Sarah learned to make shots that would have seemed like magic to anyone watching. She fired bullets that bounced off metal plates at calculated angles to hit targets she couldn't see directly. She learned to use reflective surfaces to shoot around obstacles, controlling ricochets with mathematical precision. "This isn't just showing off," Commander Morrison explained during one particularly challenging exercise. "In real operations, you might need to neutralize a target who's using hostages as cover, or eliminate a threat in a room you can't enter, or take out an enemy sniper who's positioned where no direct shot is possible." The training scenarios grew increasingly complex. Sarah found herself shooting from moving vehicles at moving targets, making precision shots while suspended from ropes, even firing accurately underwater using specialized ammunition. Each challenge pushed her abilities further, but more importantly, each success built her confidence in ways that traditional training never could have. The key difference between what we're teaching you and conventional sniper training, Dr. Walsh explained during a debriefing session, is that we're not trying to eliminate variables. We're teaching you to dance with them. But it wasn't just about the shooting. Sarah was also learning about the psychological aspects of her future missions.
Unlike traditional snipers who often operated with extensive intelligence and planning, she would frequently be inserted into fluid situations with minimal information and maximum stakes. You need to be able to read a situation in seconds and make life and death decisions with incomplete information, Bradley instructed, during a simulation where Sarah had to identify the correct target among multiple possibilities while a clock counted down from 60 seconds. The pressure was intense, but Sarah found that her natural intuition, the same instinct that had helped her predict trajectories as a child, also helped her read human behavior and identify threats. She could sense when someone was about to move, predict which way they would go, even anticipate their reactions to changing circumstances. "It's like you can see 3 seconds into the future," Chief Santos observed after Sarah successfully identified and neutralized a target who had been disguised among a group of civilians in a complex urban warfare simulation. "I don't see the future," Sarah replied, checking her equipment after the exercise. "I see the present more completely than most people. Everything is connected. Body language, timing, environmental factors, even things like lighting and sound. When you see all the connections, you can predict what happens next." This ability became crucial during the most challenging phase of her training, live fire exercises with other special operations personnel playing the roles of both hostages and threats. These scenarios were as close to real combat as possible without actual enemy combatants. During one particularly intense exercise, Sarah was tasked with rescuing a hostage being held by 3 terrorists in a building designed to replicate a real-world crisis situation. The twist was that she couldn't see any of the participants directly. She had to use mirrors, camera feeds, and sound to track their movements and wait for the perfect moment to take her shots. You have multiple hostages, unknown number of hostiles, and civilian bystanders in adjacent rooms. Rules of engagement: you cannot fire unless you are 100% certain of your target and you have 0 risk of collateral damage. Sarah studied the feeds from multiple cameras, listening to audio from directional microphones, watching for patterns in the movement she could detect through reflections and shadows. The terrorists were played by experienced special operations personnel who knew how to stay hidden and create complex tactical problems. For 47 minutes, Sarah waited and watched, tracking the subtle signs that indicated where each person was positioned. She identified the 3 hostiles, confirmed the location of 2 hostages, and detected the presence of civilians in adjacent rooms who weren't part of the exercise but whose safety had to be considered. Then, in a sequence that lasted exactly 12 seconds, Sarah fired 3 shots in rapid succession. Each bullet followed a different path. One bounced off 2 different metal surfaces before finding its target. Another passed through a narrow gap that was only aligned correctly for a fraction of a second. And the third curved around an obstacle using a technique she learned just weeks earlier. All 3 terrorists were eliminated simultaneously. 0 risk to hostages or civilians. Mission accomplished. The debriefing room was quiet for a long moment after the exercise ended. Finally, one of the terrorists, a Navy SEAL with 15 years of special operations experience, spoke up. "In all my years of training and combat, I've never seen anything like that. Those shots weren't just accurate, they were impossible, and you made them look routine." But Sarah was already thinking about the imperfections in her performance, the split-second hesitations that could mean the difference between success and failure in a real operation. "When do I get to find out what this is all for?" she asked Morrison. "What's the actual mission?" Morrison exchanged glances with the other instructors. He said, "Tomorrow you're going to meet someone who will explain why we've invested 6 weeks in turning you into something that doesn't officially exist."
The next morning, Sarah was escorted to a part of the facility she'd never seen before, a secure conference room with equipment that suggested video conferences with very important people. When she entered, she found Commander Morrison waiting with a woman in navy dress blues whose rank insignia identified her as a Rear Admiral. "Sarah Martinez," Morrison said, "meet Rear Admiral Patricia Chen, Director of Naval Special Warfare Operations." Admiral Chen was a compact woman with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. She gestured for Sarah to sit, then activated a secure communication system that connected them to what appeared to be a Pentagon briefing room. "What you're about to hear is classified at the highest levels," Admiral Chen began. "The mission we're discussing has been authorized by the Secretary of Defense and approved by the Joint Chiefs. Failure is not an option, and success will save hundreds, possibly thousands, of lives." The main screen showed a satellite image of a compound in what Sarah recognized as Middle Eastern terrain. 3 days ago, intelligence sources confirmed the location of Hassan al-Rashid, a terrorist leader responsible for coordinating attacks across multiple countries. He's not just a high-value target, he's actively planning an attack that would make 9/11 look small by comparison. Sarah studied the image, already analyzing the tactical challenges it presented. The compound was built into a mountainside with multiple levels and complex sightlines. Traditional approaches would be nearly impossible. Al-Rashid has been untouchable for 8 years, Admiral Chen continued. He survived 17 different assassination attempts by various international agencies. He never stays in the same location for more than 72 hours, never follows predictable patterns, and always surrounds himself with civilians and family members to complicate any direct action. A new image appeared, architectural diagrams of the compound showing its internal layout. But our intelligence indicates he'll be in this specific location for exactly 4 hours, 3 days from now. He's meeting with financiers for the attack he's planning, and this is our only window. "What makes this different from the other attempts?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect she knew the answer. "Location and circumstances," Commander Morrison replied, bringing up a 3D model of the compound and surrounding terrain. "Al-Rashid will be in a room that can't be approached directly. The only possible shot requires a trajectory that curves around 2 different obstacles, passes through a gap that will be aligned correctly for less than 15 seconds, and hits a target that will be visible for no more than 3 seconds. Sarah studied the model, already calculating angles and variables. "What's the distance?" Admiral Chen replied. 837 meters, uphill, in mountain wind conditions that change unpredictably. The shot also has to be taken from a position where you'll have no backup, no extraction support, and no second chance. The complexity of the challenge was staggering, but Sarah found herself oddly calm as she analyzed the requirements. This was what all her training had been leading to, a shot that combined every unconventional technique she'd learned. "The timing window is critical," Morrison added, showing her detailed intelligence about Al-Rashid's expected movements. "He'll only be in position for those 3 seconds once during the entire 4-hour window. Miss that moment, and he disappears for another unknown period while his attack moves forward." "What attack are we talking about?" Sarah asked. Admiral Chen's expression grew grim. "Coordinated strikes on major population centers using weaponized drones. The intelligence suggests casualties in the hundreds of thousands, with economic disruption that could trigger global instability." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. She thought about the child in the hostage video Morrison had shown her weeks ago, about the 14 civilians who died when traditional sniper capabilities weren't enough. "There's something else you need to know," Admiral Chen continued. "Al-Rashid has been made aware that someone is specifically hunting him. He knows that conventional assassination attempts have failed, and intelligence suggests he's taken additional precautions specifically designed to defeat sniper attacks." "What kind of precautions?" "The room where he'll be meeting has been modified with ballistic glass designed to deflect rifle rounds. The only way to make this shot work is to use the ricochet technique you've been perfecting, combined with timing that accounts for his movement patterns." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of these experienced military professionals, all of whom were depending on abilities she'd only recently discovered she possessed. "Why me? You must have operators with more experience, more proven track records in actual combat." "Because," Admiral Chen replied, "this isn't about experience or proven track records. This is about capability. And after reviewing your training performance, every expert we've consulted agrees that you're the only person who can make this shot." Morrison activated another screen showing training footage from Sarah's recent exercises. "Watch this," he said, playing back the sequence where she had made 3 impossible shots in 12 seconds. "Every ballistics expert who's analyzed this footage says those shots violate the laws of physics, but you made them anyway.
Because I stopped trying to fight physics and started working with it, Sarah replied, understanding now why her unconventional training had been so important. Exactly. And Al-Rashid's compound presents a physics problem that conventional thinking can't solve. But your approach, seeing the entire system, understanding the connections between all the variables, trusting your intuition to guide the mechanics, that's what this mission requires. Admiral Chen leaned forward. Sarah, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about stopping one terrorist or preventing one attack. The intelligence community believes that Al-Rashid's network has been developing new tactics specifically designed to counter our traditional special operations capabilities. If we can't adapt, if we can't develop new approaches to impossible problems, we're going to lose a lot of good people and fail to protect a lot of innocent lives. The room fell silent as Sarah absorbed the full scope of what was being asked of her. This wasn't just about proving her abilities or overcoming her past failure at basic training. This was about becoming something entirely new, a capability that didn't exist before, designed to solve problems that had no existing solutions. "When do I leave?" she asked. Admiral Chen smiled for the first time since the briefing had begun. "Transport leaves in 6 hours. You'll be inserted into position tomorrow night and you'll have approximately 18 hours to study the terrain and prepare for the shot." "What happens after? Assuming the mission succeeds?" "That depends on whether you want to continue doing this kind of work," Morrison replied. "What we've created here, this training program, these capabilities, this is just the beginning. There are other impossible problems that need solving, other situations where conventional approaches aren't enough." Sarah thought about her family, about the diner in Riverside, about the life she'd left behind when she'd failed at Fort Benning 18 months earlier. Then she thought about the hundreds of thousands of lives that hung in the balance, about the children who might die if Al-Rashid's attack succeeded, about the future attacks that would follow if this new form of terrorism wasn't stopped. "I need to call my family," she said. "You can't tell them anything specific about the mission," Admiral Chen warned. "I know. But I need to hear my grandmother's voice. She always told me that God doesn't give us challenges we can't handle, but sometimes He waits until the last moment to show us how strong we really are." As Sarah left the briefing room to make her call, she caught her reflection in the polished surface of a door. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the defeated recruit who had packed her bags at Fort Benning 18 months earlier. This woman had confidence in her eyes, purpose in her posture, and the quiet certainty of someone who had discovered their true calling. In 6 hours, she would board a plane that would take her halfway around the world to attempt something that every expert said was impossible. But for the first time in her life, impossible felt like exactly the right challenge for Sarah Martinez.
The transport plane touched down at a classified airfield in Afghanistan under cover of darkness. Sarah had spent the 12-hour flight reviewing satellite imagery, weather reports, and intelligence updates about Al-Rashid's compound. Every detail had been memorized, every variable calculated. But she knew that real-world conditions would present challenges no briefing could fully prepare her for. She was met on the ground by Master Chief Kowalski and a 2-man team of Delta Force operators who would provide security and extraction support. The mood was professional but tense. Everyone understood the stakes. "Weather's not cooperating," Kowalski reported as they loaded her specialized equipment into a modified Humvee. "Wind patterns are more erratic than predicted, and there's a dust storm moving in that could affect visibility." Sarah nodded, checking her custom rifle one final time. The weapon had been modified specifically for this mission, with advanced optics that could compensate for atmospheric conditions, and specialized ammunition designed for the long-distance ricochets she would need to execute. "How long to reach the position?" she asked. 4 hours cross-country," replied Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, the senior Delta operator. "We'll get you within 2 clicks of your shooting position, then you'll make the final approach alone." The drive through the Afghan mountains was surreal. Sarah found herself thinking about the path that had brought her here. From failure at basic training to this moment where hundreds of thousands of lives depended on her ability to make an impossible shot. The contrast was so extreme, it felt like someone else's story. "You nervous?" asked the other Delta operator, Sergeant First Class David Kim, during a brief stop to check their route. "Strangely, no," Sarah replied, and realized it was true.
I was terrified during basic training qualification, but this feels different. Maybe because I understand what I'm doing now instead of trying to force myself into someone else's methods. Or maybe, Kowalski suggested, because you know this is what you are meant to do. They reached the insertion point just after midnight. The terrain was harsh, rocky, steep, with visibility limited by shifting dust and unpredictable wind. Sarah would have to cover the remaining distance on foot, carrying her rifle and equipment to a position that offered the only possible angle for the shot. Remember, Kowalski said as she prepared to leave, you have one chance. Al-Rashid will be in position for exactly 3 seconds between 14:27 and 14:30 local time. Miss that window, and he disappears again. I won't miss, Sarah replied, surprised by her own certainty. The climb to her shooting position took 3 hours. The route had been planned to avoid Al-Rashid's security perimeter, but it meant traversing terrain that challenged every aspect of her physical conditioning. By the time she reached the rocky outcropping that would serve as her hide, Sarah was exhausted, but focused. She spent the next hour setting up her position with meticulous care. The shooting rest had to be perfectly stable, the rifle positioned to account for the complex angles required for the ricochet shots, and her own body arranged to minimize fatigue during the long wait ahead. As dawn broke over the mountains, Sarah began her detailed observation of the target compound. Through her scope, she could see the building where Al-Rashid would appear, the obstacles her bullet would need to navigate, and the environmental factors that would affect her shot. The compound was even more challenging than the intelligence had indicated. The ballistic glass Admiral Chen had mentioned was visible in the windows, angled specifically to deflect direct shots. The gap her bullet would need to pass through was smaller than expected, and the metal surfaces she would use for ricochets showed signs of wear that could affect how bullets bounced off them. But as Sarah studied the target area, her trained eye began to see solutions that others had missed. The angles weren't just obstacles. They were part of a complex system that could be used to redirect the bullet's path in ways that traditional ballistics wouldn't predict. The timing window wasn't just a limitation, it was synchronized with other environmental factors that could actually improve her chances if she understood how to use them. "This is Overwatch," came a voice through her earpiece, the surveillance team that was monitoring the compound from another position. Target arrived on schedule, multiple vehicles, heavy security presence. Sarah settled into her shooting position and began the mental preparation that would carry her through the next several hours. She controlled her breathing, relaxed her muscles, and entered the focused state that allowed her to perceive the subtle connections between all the variables that would determine success or failure. At 10:30 local time, movement in the compound indicated that Al-Rashid had arrived for his meeting. Sarah could see increased activity through her scope, but the terrorist leader himself remained out of sight, protected by the compound's defensive design. "Target is inside the building," reported the surveillance team. "Meeting is expected to begin at 1400, which puts him in your window exactly on schedule." Sarah acknowledged the report and continued her patient observation. She watched the wind patterns, studied the way light reflected off the metal surfaces she would use for ricochets, and visualized the bullet's path through the complex sequence of bounces and redirections it would need to follow. At 13:45, 15 minutes before the critical moment, Sarah made her final adjustments. The wind had shifted slightly, requiring a minor change to her aim point. The lighting conditions were different than predicted, which would affect how she read the reflections that would guide her targeting. But as Sarah studied the target area, her trained eye began to see solutions that others had missed. The angles weren't just obstacles. They were part of a complex system that could be used to redirect the bullet's path in ways that traditional ballistics wouldn't predict. The timing window wasn't just a limitation, it was synchronized with other environmental factors that could actually improve her chances if she understood how to use them. "This is Overwatch," came a voice through her earpiece, the surveillance team that was monitoring the compound from another position. Target arrived on schedule, multiple vehicles, heavy security presence. Sarah settled into her shooting position and began the mental preparation that would carry her through the next several hours. She controlled her breathing, relaxed her muscles, and entered the focused state that allowed her to perceive the subtle connections between all the variables that would determine success or failure. At 10:30 local time, movement in the compound indicated that Al-Rashid had arrived for his meeting. Sarah could see increased activity through her scope, but the terrorist leader himself remained out of sight, protected by the compound's defensive design.
Target is inside the building, reported the surveillance team. Meeting is expected to begin at 1400, which puts him in your window exactly on schedule. Sarah acknowledged the report and continued her patient observation. She watched the wind patterns, studied the way light reflected off the metal surfaces she would use for ricochets, and visualized the bullet's path through the complex sequence of bounces and redirections it would need to follow. At 13:45, 15 minutes before the critical moment, Sarah made her final adjustments. The wind had shifted slightly, requiring a minor change to her aim point. The lighting conditions were different than predicted, which would affect how she read the reflections that would guide her targeting. But most importantly, Sarah felt the same calm certainty that had carried her through her training. This wasn't about forcing a solution. It was about becoming part of the system that would deliver the bullet to its target.
All stations, this is command. Admiral Chen's voice came through the communications network. 15 minutes to window. Target is confirmed in the building. Sarah closed her eyes for 30 seconds, running through the entire sequence one final time in her mind. When she opened them, she was ready to attempt the impossible.
At 14:25, 2 minutes before the target window opened, Sarah's earpiece crackled with urgent intelligence updates. "Sarah, this is command. We have a problem." Admiral Chen's voice carried a tension that made Sarah's heart race. "Intelligence intercept indicates al-Rashid knows about the assassination attempt. He's changed his position within the compound." Sarah kept her rifle trained on the original target area while her mind rapidly processed this new information. Where is he now? "We're not certain. Surveillance shows movement in multiple rooms, and he's using body doubles to confuse our tracking. The meeting is still happening, but we don't know which figure is the actual target." Through her scope, Sarah could see several men moving through the compound's windows, brief glimpses of figures that could be al-Rashid or could be decoys designed to waste her one chance at the shot. "How much time do I have to identify him?" she asked, making micro-adjustments to her position while scanning for any detail that might reveal the real target. The meeting window remains the same. Somewhere between 14:27 and 14:30, the real al-Rashid will appear in one of 3 possible positions. You'll have to identify and engage the correct target within that 3-second window. Sarah felt her training kick in. This wasn't just about making an impossible shot anymore. It was about making an impossible shot at a target she would have to identify in real time while under the ultimate pressure. "Sarah, this is Dr. Walsh, patched in from the command center. Remember your training about reading systems and predicting behavior. You have the ability to see patterns that others miss. Trust your instincts." At 14:26, activity in the compound increased dramatically. Sarah could see movement in all 3 possible target locations, and through her advanced optics, she caught glimpses of men who matched al-Rashid's general description. Then, at 14:27:15, the critical window opened. In the eastern window of the compound, a figure appeared briefly, partially obscured by ballistic glass, visible only as a shadowy outline. Sarah's training took over as she analyzed every detail she could perceive: posture, movement patterns, the way the figure carried himself. Simultaneously, another figure appeared in the northern window, and a third in the western position. For exactly 1.2 seconds, all 3 potential targets were visible at the same time. Sarah's mind processed information at superhuman speed. The eastern figure moved with the careful gait of someone much older than al-Rashid. The western figure's posture suggested someone trying too hard to appear authoritative, likely a body double overacting the role. But the northern figure? The northern figure moved with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never doubted his own authority. His positioning in the room suggested he was the focus of the meeting, not just a participant. Most importantly, there was something about the way he held his head, a subtle detail that matched intelligence photos Sarah had memorized. But the northern position presented the most difficult shot. To reach that target, her bullet would need to ricochet off 3 different surfaces, pass through a gap that was only aligned for milliseconds, and strike a target she could barely see through multiple layers of distortion. In the zero point 0.8 seconds she had left in the window, Sarah made her choice. Every instinct, every hour of training, every pattern recognition system in her brain pointed to the northern figure as the real al-Rashid. She adjusted her aim point to account for the complex ricochet sequence, compensated for wind and atmospheric conditions, and trusted the mathematical calculations her training had made instinctive. At 14:27:28, with less than 2 seconds remaining in the window, Sarah Martinez squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed across the mountainous terrain, but Sarah kept her eye glued to the scope, tracking the bullet's path through its impossible journey. She watched it strike the first ricochet point exactly where calculated, bounce at the predicted angle toward the second surface, redirect again toward the narrow gap that was aligned for exactly the right fraction of a second. The bullet passed through the gap, curved around the final obstacle, and struck the ballistic glass of the northern window at precisely the angle needed to penetrate rather than deflect. Through her scope, Sarah saw the figure in the northern position collapse. For a moment that felt like eternity, silence filled the communications channel. Then, chaos erupted in the compound below as security forces realized what had happened. "Target down," reported the surveillance team. "Northern position confirmed impact." But confirmation of a hit wasn't the same as confirmation of mission success. Had Sarah identified the correct target, or had she just killed an innocent person while the real al-Rashid escaped? "Command, this is surveillance. We're getting intercepts from the compound's communications. They're confirming that al-Rashid is down. Repeat, Hassan al-Rashid is confirmed dead." The relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense it nearly made her collapse. She had done it. Not just the impossible shot, but the correct impossible shot, under conditions that had challenged every aspect of her training and abilities. "Sarah, this is Admiral Chen. Outstanding work. Begin your extraction immediately." As Sarah began breaking down her shooting position and preparing to move to the extraction point, her earpiece carried one more message that made her smile. "Sarah, this is Dr. Walsh. I told you that you could see patterns others miss. That wasn't just about ballistics, it was about everything. You just proved that intuition, properly trained and trusted, can accomplish things that pure technical skill never could." The journey back to the extraction point would be dangerous, and Sarah knew her adrenaline would soon give way to exhaustion. But for this moment, as she looked out over the Afghan mountains where she had just accomplished the impossible, Sarah Martinez felt something she had never experienced before: the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do.
The extraction went smoothly, but the real impact of Sarah's success didn't become clear until she was back at the command center 12 hours later. As she entered the briefing room, she found it packed with military personnel she didn't recognize: officers from multiple branches, intelligence officials, and civilians who carried themselves with the quiet authority of people who made decisions at the highest levels of government. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Chen announced as Sarah entered, "I'd like you to meet the person who just prevented what our intelligence services believe would have been the deadliest terrorist attack in modern history." The room erupted in applause, but Sarah felt oddly detached from the celebration. The adrenaline of the mission had faded, replaced by a profound awareness of how much had changed in the space of a single shot. She wasn't the same person who had failed basic training, but she wasn't quite sure who she had become. "The intelligence we've gathered from al-Rashid's compound in the hours since the operation confirms our worst fears about the planned attack," Admiral Chen continued, activating a display screen that showed maps, documents, and photographs recovered from the site. "Coordinated drone strikes on major population centers using weaponized chemical agents that would have killed hundreds of thousands of people." Sarah studied the intelligence materials with growing horror.
The scope of the planned attack was beyond anything she had imagined. Schools, hospitals, shopping centers, all targeted specifically to maximize civilian casualties and create maximum psychological impact. The attack was scheduled to begin in 6 days, added a man Sarah didn't recognize, who introduced himself as Deputy Director of National Intelligence. Without your success, we would have been powerless to prevent it. But as the briefing continued, Sarah learned that her mission had accomplished more than just stopping one attack. The intelligence recovered from al-Rashid's compound in the hours since the operation confirmed our worst fears about the planned attack. The intelligence recovered from al-Rashid's compound was already leading to operations around the world, disrupting terrorist networks that had been operating in secret for years. This is what victory looks like in the modern world, Admiral Chen explained during a private conversation after the main briefing. Not armies defeating armies on battlefields, but one person with exceptional skills preventing mass casualties through precision application of force. What happens now? Sarah asked, still processing the magnitude of what her single shot had accomplished. Now, you get to choose your future. What we've created with your training, this capability to solve impossible tactical problems, there's enormous demand for it across the special operations community. Commander Morrison, who had been quiet during most of the briefing, finally spoke up. Sarah, what you did yesterday wasn't just about exceptional marksmanship. It was about seeing a complex system and understanding how to work within it rather than against it. That's a capability that applies to far more than just shooting. Over the following days, Sarah learned about other situations where conventional special operations approaches had failed. Hostage rescues that required impossible precision. Counterterrorism operations in urban environments where collateral damage couldn't be risked. And reconnaissance missions that demanded capabilities no existing training program had ever developed. We're not talking about making you a traditional special operator, Admiral Chen explained during a career planning session. We're talking about creating an entirely new category of military capability. You'd work directly with SEAL teams, Delta Force, and other elite units, but as a specialist who gets called in when their standard approaches aren't sufficient. The offer was tempting, but Sarah found herself thinking about her family, about the life she had left behind when she'd first tried to serve her country. She requested permission to return home for a brief leave before making her decision about the future. The reunion with her family in Los Angeles was surreal. They knew she had been involved in some kind of classified military training, but they had no idea their daughter and sister had just prevented one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in modern history. Sarah found herself sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table, drinking café con leche, and trying to process how dramatically her life had changed. Mija, her grandmother said in Spanish, studying Sarah's face with the wisdom of someone who had lived through decades of family triumphs and tragedies. Something important happened to you. Sarah nodded, unable to share details, but needing to talk about the weight of what she now carried. I found out what I'm supposed to do with my life, abuela, but it's dangerous, and it means I might not be able to come home very often. Her grandmother reached across the table and took Sarah's hands. When you were little, you used to throw stones at cans for hours, remember? I watched you, and I knew you were learning something important, not just about throwing stones, but about seeing things differently than other people. You remember that? A grandmother remembers everything important about her granddaughter. You were always meant to do something that required seeing what others couldn't see. I just didn't know it would be something so serious. That evening, her brother Marcus, now a Marine Corps veteran with 2 deployments behind him, pulled her aside for a private conversation. I can see it in your eyes, he said simply. Whatever happened during your training, you found your place. The question is whether you're going to embrace it or let fear hold you back. It's not fear, Sarah replied. It's responsibility. When you can do something that no one else can do, when lives depend on abilities you barely understand yourself, then you do it, because the alternative is letting people die who don't have to die. 2 days later, Sarah called Admiral Chen and accepted the position, but she had one condition. She wanted to help develop training programs that could identify and develop similar capabilities in other people. The problem isn't just that I can make impossible shots, she explained during the phone call. The problem is that I'm probably not the only person with these kinds of latent abilities. If we can figure out how to identify and train others, we can create something bigger than just one specialized operator. Admiral Chen was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, she finally said, I think you just described the next evolution of special operations warfare.
6 months after the Al-Rashid mission, Sarah found herself back at the Naval Special Warfare Advanced Capabilities Development Center, but this time her role was completely different. Instead of being the student learning impossible techniques, she was now the instructor, helping to identify and train the next generation of specialized operators. The program had evolved rapidly following the success of her mission. Intelligence agencies and special operations commands from around the world had requested access to the training methods that had produced such exceptional results. Sarah was now working with a team of psychologists, physicists, and veteran operators to develop assessment and training protocols that could be replicated on a larger scale. The key insight, Dr. Walsh explained during a briefing for visiting military officials, is that traditional selection and training methods often eliminate exactly the people who have the greatest potential for these specialized capabilities. We were selecting for conformity when we should have been selecting for exceptional cognitive flexibility. Sarah nodded, remembering her own journey from basic training failure to special operations success. Most military training is designed to make people predictable and reliable, but the problems we're solving require people who can be unpredictable in controlled ways, who can see solutions that don't exist in any manual or training program. The new candidates arriving for assessment came from diverse backgrounds. Some were military personnel who had shown unusual problem-solving abilities but hadn't succeeded in traditional special operations selection. Others were civilians with demonstrated capabilities in areas like competitive shooting, mathematics, or even video gaming, fields that required the kind of rapid pattern recognition and three-dimensional thinking that translated well to specialized military applications. One of the new candidates particularly impressed Sarah, a former Army medic named David Park, who had been discharged after a training accident left him with hearing damage that disqualified him from standard infantry roles. Despite his hearing loss, David demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to predict the movement of people and objects in complex environments. "Watch this," Sarah said to Commander Morrison during David's assessment, as the young veteran navigated a training scenario that required him to predict the paths of multiple moving targets while blindfolded. He's compensating for his hearing loss by developing enhanced spatial awareness that gives him capabilities most people don't have. "Can we train that?" Morrison asked. "We can enhance it," Sarah replied, "just like they enhanced my natural pattern recognition abilities. The question is whether we can develop assessment methods that identify these latent capabilities before we accidentally eliminate people who have them." The training program itself had also evolved. Sarah's success with ricochet shooting had led to the development of entirely new tactical approaches that were being integrated into special operations missions around the world. But more importantly, the underlying methodology, learning to work with complex systems rather than trying to overpower them, was being applied to other military challenges. We've had requests from Army Rangers who want training in unconventional movement techniques, Air Force pilots who want to develop enhanced spatial awareness for complex flight environments, even Navy divers who need to navigate underwater obstacles that sonar can't map effectively. But the most significant development was the success of the first graduates from the expanded program. 3 months after Sarah's mission, a SEAL team had used ricochet shooting techniques to eliminate a high-value target in a situation where conventional approaches would have been impossible. 2 weeks later, a Delta Force operator trained in Sarah's predictive targeting methods had successfully rescued hostages from a moving vehicle, a scenario that had never been accomplished before. "What we've created here," Admiral Chen explained during a visit from Pentagon officials, "isn't just a new training program. It's a fundamental shift in how we think about human capabilities and military problem solving."
Sarah found herself at the center of discussions about the future of special operations warfare. Her success had proven that individual capabilities, properly identified and developed, could accomplish things that no amount of traditional training or advanced equipment could achieve. But success brought new challenges. Foreign intelligence agencies were attempting to recruit personnel with knowledge of the program. Military contractors were offering enormous sums for access to the training methods. Even allied nations were requesting their own personnel be included in the training pipeline. The demand is exceeding our capacity, Morrison admitted during a private conversation with Sarah. We're getting requests for capabilities we've barely begun to develop ourselves. Maybe that's the point, Sarah replied, looking out at the training facilities where new candidates were learning to push the boundaries of what was possible. Maybe we're not supposed to keep this centralized. Maybe we're supposed to figure out how to distribute these capabilities as widely as possible. The idea was radical. Instead of maintaining a small, highly classified program that produced a few exceptional operators, what if they developed methods that could enhance human performance across the entire military? What if the techniques that had turned Sarah from a basic training failure into someone capable of impossible precision could be adapted to help thousands of service members unlock capabilities they didn't know they possessed? It would change everything, Admiral Chen mused when Sarah presented the concept during a strategic planning session. Not just how we conduct special operations, but how we think about human potential in military contexts. As Sarah looked around the conference room at the military leaders who were responsible for protecting national security, she realized that her journey was far from over. The shot that had stopped al-Rashid had just been the beginning. Now she was part of something that could reshape how the military identified, developed, and deployed human capabilities in an era when traditional approaches were no longer sufficient for the challenges they faced. "So, what's our next impossible mission?" she asked, smiling at the thought of all the young men and women who would soon discover, as she had, that failure could be the first step towards finding your true calling.
2 years after the El Rashid mission, Sarah Martinez stood before a joint session of military leadership from NATO countries, delivering a presentation that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier. The woman who had once been told she couldn't hit the broadside of a barn was now explaining how her methods had been successfully implemented across multiple military organizations worldwide. "The paradigm shift we've achieved," Sarah explained, using a laser pointer to highlight statistics on a large display screen, "isn't just about improving individual performance. It's about fundamentally changing how we approach impossible problems, by recognizing that human capability extends far beyond what traditional selection and training methods can identify or develop." The results spoke for themselves. In the 24 months since the program's expansion, operations using enhanced human capability approaches had achieved a success rate 30% higher than conventional methods. More importantly, missions that would previously have been classified as impossible were now being completed routinely by operators trained in Sarah's methodologies. Admiral Chen, now promoted to Vice Admiral and serving as Director of Joint Special Operations Development, provided context for Sarah's presentation. What began as a desperate attempt to solve one seemingly impossible tactical problem has evolved into a comprehensive reimagining of human potential in military contexts. The success stories were remarkable. A Navy SEAL team had successfully infiltrated a terrorist compound in Somalia using movement prediction techniques that allowed them to navigate past security systems without triggering alarms. Army Rangers in Afghanistan had rescued hostages from a cave complex by using ricochet shooting methods to eliminate threats around corners and behind obstacles. Air Force Special Operations personnel had conducted precision strikes in urban environments with 0 civilian casualties by applying enhanced spatial awareness training to complex three-dimensional targeting challenges. But perhaps most significantly, the program had identified and developed capabilities in personnel who would never have been considered for special operations roles under traditional selection criteria.
David Park, the former Army medic with hearing damage, had become one of the most effective operators in the program, using his enhanced spatial awareness to conduct reconnaissance missions that provided intelligence previously obtainable only through technological means. The most important lesson we've learned, Sarah continued her presentation, is that exceptional capability often exists in people who don't fit conventional profiles. We were eliminating our best potential assets by selecting for conformity instead of selecting for unique cognitive abilities. During a break in the presentation, Sarah stepped outside to get some fresh air and found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scared young woman who had packed her bags at Fort Benning in defeat felt like someone from another lifetime. The skills and confidence she had developed weren't just about shooting, they had transformed how she approached every challenge in her life. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother Marcus. "Saw your interview on CNN last night. Mom cried. Dad just kept saying, 'That's my daughter,' over and over. We're proud of you, Hermana." The media attention had been unexpected, but ultimately positive. While the specific details of her missions remained classified, the general story of her transformation from basic training failure to special operations success had resonated with people around the world. Sarah had received thousands of letters from young people who felt like they didn't fit traditional molds, from parents whose children had been told they weren't good enough, and from military personnel who had been eliminated from programs because they didn't meet conventional standards. "Ms. Martinez," a voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see a young woman in Air Force uniform approaching nervously. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I was hoping I could speak with you for a moment." "Of course. What's your name?" "Second Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Dr. Walsh," the young officer said with a shy smile. "I've been following your story, and I wanted to ask you about something." "What's on your mind?" "I failed pilot training 6 months ago. They said I had excellent technical skills and perfect academics, but I couldn't adapt to the unpredictable elements of flying. My instructor said I was too rigid, that I needed to learn to go with the flow instead of trying to control everything." Sarah smiled, recognizing something familiar in the young officer's frustration. "What makes you think that's something you can't learn?" "Because I've been trying to fix it for 6 months and nothing has worked. I've taken additional training, worked with different instructors, even tried sports psychology. But every time I get into a situation where I have to adapt to changing conditions, I freeze up." "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, leaning against the building wall. "What do you do when you're not in the military? What are you naturally good at?" Lieutenant Walsh looked confused by the question. I play chess competitively. I'm actually ranked pretty highly in my state. And I do jigsaw puzzles, really complex ones with thousands of pieces. Both of those activities require you to see patterns, adapt to changing situations, and work with systems that you can't completely control. When you're playing chess against a skilled opponent, they do unexpected things, right? How do you handle that? "I study their patterns, figure out their style, and adapt my strategy accordingly," the young woman replied, then paused as she realized what Sarah was getting at. "The problem isn't that you can't adapt to unpredictable situations. The problem is that pilot training methods don't work with how your brain processes information. You need training that builds on your natural pattern recognition abilities instead of fighting against them." The young officer's eyes widened. "Are you saying there might be a place for me in your program?" "I'm saying there might be a place for you in aviation that plays to your strengths instead of your perceived weaknesses. Have you ever heard of unmanned aerial vehicle operations or air traffic control systems that require managing multiple complex, rapidly changing situations simultaneously?" As they continued talking, Sarah felt the same excitement she had experienced when she first discovered her own hidden capabilities. This young officer wasn't a failure who needed to be fixed. She was someone with exceptional abilities that had simply been applied to the wrong challenges. "Lieutenant," Sarah said as their conversation concluded, "I want you to talk to Admiral Chen about our pilot enhancement program. I think you might find that your so-called weakness is actually your greatest strength." Later that evening, as Sarah reviewed the day's presentations and planned for the next phase of program expansion, she reflected on how much had changed since that night in the diner when 3 Navy SEALs had walked into her life. The program they had started together was now helping thousands of military personnel discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. But more than that, it was changing how society thought about failure and success, about conformity and exceptional ability, about the difference between being different and being wrong. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Admiral Chen. "Sarah, I just got off a call with the Secretary of Defense. There's a situation developing that requires capabilities we've never tested before. Are you ready for your next impossible mission?" Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar surge of excitement and purpose that came with being asked to solve problems that had no existing solutions. "Always," she replied. "What's the challenge?" As Admiral Chan began briefing her on the new mission, Sarah looked out the window at the stars above Virginia and thought about all the young people who would someday discover, as she had, that their greatest failures might just be preparation for their most important successes. The journey from failure to excellence wasn't a destination. It was a way of approaching the world that recognized the extraordinary potential hidden within the ordinary, the impossible possibilities waiting within apparent limitations, and the strength that could emerge from the courage to try again when everyone said it was hopeless. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell.